Thank you all for joining us today. So the goal of today's discussion is to evaluate the Washington Consensus, discuss what has worked well and what has not, its effects on inequality, the inclusiveness of growth, the policy autonomy of sovereign states. We will also discuss the rise of China and what is the right kind of globalization. Finally, although the effects of the COVID-19 crisis remain largely unclear, we will also talk about some of the pre-crisis trends that our two guests have previously discussed and engage in some intuitive speculation as to whether this crisis will change any of that. Thank you once again, professors. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Before we start, I'd like to briefly remind us all of what the Washington Consensus is, so that the policies we are referring to are fresh in everyone's minds, both for our guests and audience. These are the 10 specific principles that were originally set out by John Williamson in 1989 are as follows: low government borrowing, shifting from subsidies to sectors, investments in primary education, primary healthcare, and infrastructure, broadening the tax base and adopting moderate marginal tax rates, selecting interest rates that are determined by the market, encouraging competitive exchange rates through free floating currency exchange, adoption of free trade policies, such as the liberalization of imports, the removing of trade barriers, such as tariffs and quotas, and relaxing the rules on foreign direct investment. And for the last three, the privatization of state enterprise, usually linked to railways, oil and gas, the eradication of regulations and policies that restrict competition or add unnecessary barriers to entry, and the development of property rights. So to jump right into it, could you please state your general position or attitude on the Washington Consensus? Which of its policies have been broadly beneficial and which should be tamed or entirely stopped? So to start off with, I was thinking Professor Rodrik could give us his view on this.
I think the Washington Consensus was the product of a period of evolution in thinking about economic policy that started in the late 70s and then took on considerable force in the early 80s with Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Reagan, Ronald Reagan in the United States. That was sort of a kind of a rejection of the much more interventionist Keynesian policies that had been the norm in the 50s and 60s and much of the 70s. Part of it was that, a sense that the Keynesian policies hadn't worked out very well in the 1970s with the oil shock. Part of it was that there was a sense that the state was overextended, that the limits of the welfare state was being reached, that there was too much active management of the economy, too high marginal tax rates, too much regulation, and that in developing countries in particular, very high levels of protection, which had been layered on top of each other over a period of decades, and it was very difficult to make sense of what the objective of these policies, of these protective policies were. And then from the perspective of developing countries, of course, culminating in the debt crisis of the 1980s, which was largely a reflection of macroeconomic policies that had not adjusted appropriately, or in some cases had gone out of whack as a consequence of the oil crisis. So a certain degree of adjustment in the way that we were thinking about policies was probably appropriate. A rediscovery of the importance of markets and the role of private incentives, the importance of stable macroeconomic policies. I think that's probably some of that kind of orthodoxy was useful. I think what happened with the Washington Consensus is that it got transformed from, in fact, even in its original formulation that you mentioned by John Williamson, it got transformed from a kind of relatively loosely articulated directional change to a much more detailed, much more, I would say, dogmatic a set of principles that wasn't simply, for example, let's take advantage of world markets and let's avoid excessive protectionism. It actually became, in practice, let's apply uniform tariffs that don't go beyond 15% on most commodities. Let's liberalize the financial sector without concern for financial stability. And so it became in practice a kind of a rather dogmatic and mindless application of some principles that you couldn't, some policies that you couldn't even defend on the basis of economic principles in real applications. And I think that's where it ended up going wrong.
And Professor Milanovic?
Well, I would agree with Dani. I think that when you read it, I mean, let me make 2 points. When you read the 10 principles and you have summarized them, and actually I looked yesterday again, and there is nothing per se wrong with any of them. So, they look, as actually Williamson said, it's like the core of the sort of what serious economists so-called think. But the problem was, I think that, and a second point is that actually it was remarkably successful, because if you look at some of the, the 10 points, they have actually been sort of applied everywhere in the world practically. If you look at the situation when the Washington Consensus was defined, or even earlier, as Dani was speaking of the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, many of the things that we now take essentially for granted, like for example, low tariff rates, reduction of subsidies, the single exchange rate. I remember the time when many countries had multiple exchange rates or non-convertible currencies. Tariff rates were high. Obviously, there was very little privatization. So all of these principles actually are now seeming commonsensical, commonplace, practically. And most of the countries apply them. And look at inflation, for example, that is mentioned in the Washington Consensus, that now actually has been down to quasi-zero, and even in some cases deflation for a while. So that was very successful. I think the problem, as Dani said, and I think most people would agree, is that was applied dogmatically, and secondly, it was incomplete. So there are many points there that are right, but they are incomplete in the sense when you simply say we should privatize, you don't say anything else than that. I mean, what should be privatized? Is everything going to be privatized? How it will be privatized? Are you going to create private monopolies or not? Are you going to transfer incredible amounts of resources in the hands of the people who would not use them, or actually use them in order to sell them to somebody else, or maybe just what used to be called in Eastern Europe, tunneling the money and send it to London? So these were all other issues that basically arose from dogmatic application and from sort of one-sided or incomplete definition of the 10 commandments, as it were. So I would agree with that, actually. And I think that to some extent we have run the course of the Washington Consensus. I think that it seems to me even policy thinking and academic thinking have moved past it. And to some extent, maybe this crisis compared with the global financial crisis have further weakened sort of the orthodoxy of the Washington Consensus.
I agree. Let me add just a couple of notes. First, I think as Branko says, the Washington Consensus is essentially dead as a doctrine for development. I don't know that anybody sort of upholds it as this is the way that countries develop or grow. 2 points that sort of are not generally known about the Washington Consensus. One is that I think most people think that the Washington Consensus, because of its name, naturally, that it was actually something that was devised in Washington and then applied to developing countries, that it was forced on developing countries. Actually, it was not like that at all, that when John Williamson sat down to write down those principles, he basically was saying, I look around what is being done in Latin America today. And then this is just essentially a summary of what the current crop of technocratic, mostly US trained economists who are running policy in Latin America are doing these days. So it was a description of actual policies that were being applied by developing countries, particularly in Latin America. In fact, in many respects, Latin American governments at the time, whether it was Argentina or Chile or Mexico, went much beyond what was in the Washington Consensus in terms of adopting policies that were very, very sort of openness to trade, to finance. As John Williamson always likes to say, openness to capital flows was actually, financial globalization was never part of the Washington Consensus. It's not one of the 10 items. Domestic financial liberalization is, even not in such terms. It was like removing the worst excesses of financial repression. Again, going back to the point that we're making, that these were sort of generally loose principles. But that financial globalization, opening up to capital flows, was never part of the Washington Consensus. Yet in practice, it became a key element of sort of Washington Consensus style thinking. The other interesting anecdote about the Washington Consensus is that, as you mentioned, Oscar, the last item on the list is property rights, and probably in the 1990s. In the 2000s, that became sort of the mantra for development policy. And at the time, it was kind of an afterthought. In fact, John Williamson says that when he sat down to write those principles, he wrote them all down, and then the number was 9 of them. So all the 9 principles, and he said, well, this is not going to look very nice. I need to have a nice round number, so I have to come up with a 10th. And as an afterthought, they say, let me just add property rights. And it was never really figured, very heavily in the thinking at the time, even though it became very central later on. Again, it's sort of a bit of a reflection of how much of a product of the time the Washington Consensus was, and also how incomplete it was. Just to repeat the point that Branko mentioned.
And so, do you think that perhaps increasing the equal representation of member states within the IMF and the World Bank would be beneficial for making these policies evolve and adapt them to the local contexts? Was this dogmatism the result of academic consensus, or could increasing the voices of other countries from the global south perhaps have increased this flexibility and adaptability?
You want to take that, Branko?
No, Dani, then you'll go first. I will come next.
Well, as my story about the Washington Consensus suggests, in many matters of policy, I think finance ministers or central bank governors in the developing world are more royalist than the king. So it's not like giving them giving them more power in the World Bank wouldn't necessarily make the World Bank reflect a sort of a more diverse set of views. I think a lot has to do with patterns of socialization. Do these people come from U.S. or UK universities? Have they spent their career in the financial working as emerging market analysts, and then they go become finance ministries? I think one thing I sometimes jokingly suggest that would actually make a difference to the way that these institutions operate is if more of their operational divisions were actually based in developing countries, so that the staff were sort of much more in close contact with the realities on the ground with the developing world. And you actually see that to some extent with the bank, as the World Bank became, I think now has many more people, regional centers and country. And that's when you talk to those people, they're much more sort of feet on the ground, understand sort of that context matters, that one size fit all policies don't really work. I think the IMF suffers much more from this lack of real exposure to context. So I think so it's not simply by giving developing countries a bigger vote that you're going to have a more diverse set of policies.
Yes, I would agree definitely with that. I think it is a little bit how should I say seem too simplistic to believe that the contrast between the Washington Consensus and those who are non-Washington Consensus can be reduced to the geographical sort of distribution. I'm in favor of giving much greater role and, of course, voting rights to countries that have been, I mean, historically underrepresented in the fund and the World Bank, for the reasons that they should reflect the actual economic and general power at the moment. Because obviously, as we know, the distribution of the voting rights essentially still reflects the original distribution after the World War II, with, of course, changes which happened with the accession of the membership of China, then Russia and others, but it's still very, very biased toward West European countries in particular and the United States. So I think it should be done. Now, whether that alone would actually lead to the changes, I agree with Dani. I think it's actually the issues are more difficult. There are issues at the personal level of socialization, what is the background, universities, and so on. There are also the issues of interest. So even many developing countries may actually not have an interest to change the paradigm, or whatever is the ruling paradigm, although it is true that the Washington Consensus is no longer the paradigm that it was in the 1990s. So let me summarize. Yes, in favor of change of the voting rights, but don't believe that that alone would be sufficient to make a significant change in the way that the World Bank or the fund are being managed.
Okay. Professor Rodrik, you said in an interview, and I quote, "What we want is not the most extreme form of globalization, but the right kind of globalization." I think most people would agree with this. My question is then, what is the right kind of globalization? In other terms, what factors make international trade beneficial to all participants?
Yeah, I mean, first on the question about what kind of globalization. I mean, I think that my response sort of reflected a kind of a reaction to the terms of the debate as it's usually held, which is, are you for or against globalization? Yeah. Is globalization gone too far? Is it not gone too far enough? Is globalization now going to go back, or is it going to advance? I mean, I think this is a very not only unproductive, counterproductive way of thinking about globalization, because it presumes that there is just a kind of a sort of a spectrum where you just move along this spectrum from more to less. Now, there are some aspects of globalization for which you might say this is right. So, for example, tariffs might be higher, or they might be lower. In fact, that's the analogy that people are usually applying when they say there's more globalization, there's less globalization. But sort of the height of the tariffs are actually a very imperfect correlate or measure of how much globalization we have, or how rapidly globalization is changing. Much more important are the overall set of rules that are managing the way that markets operate. And those rules have to do not just with tariffs, they have to do with product standards, with intellectual property rights, with subsidies, with sanitary and phytosanitary standards. They have to do with the flows of capital. They have to do with the flows of labor. They have to do with global cooperation in health, in environment. All of these there's a set of either explicit, as in the case of rules that the OECD or the WTO have enunciated, or implicit in the minds of the policymakers as the kinds of things that you do and you don't, that underpin globalization. So the question is getting those rules right. And I think in some areas, those rules have become, excessively business friendly, excessively investor friendly, excessively directed towards achieving market access at the expense of domestic economic, social, or environmental goals. And so I think, with respect to financial globalization, with respect to many of the features of trade agreements, such as in the areas of subsidies, intellectual property rights, industrial policies, I think we've overreached. And so there's a sense in which the globalization of the rules that restrain what each individual nations can do have gone too far. And then there are other areas, in fact, we really should be much more globalized in terms of having a more complete and more binding set of rules. The present pandemic is a very good example of how we could have, and we should have had, much more global cooperation and coordination with respect to public health. Much more communication, much more standardization, much more common fight in terms of vaccines, in terms of development of medicines, development of medical equipment, transfers to developing countries that don't have the capacity. That's an area where we have not globalized nearly enough. There's not enough, the WHO, as we've seen, has fallen pitifully short of an organization that can provide the needed global public goods there. In the area of climate change, that's another major failure, that we don't have nearly stringent global rules that we need to have in terms of controlling greenhouse gases and ensuring that there is enough investment in green technologies. And even in sort of more narrowly economic areas, I don't think that we don't have the global rules that we should have with respect to tax havens, for example, with respect to tax evasion, which is excessively permissive right now, the policy environment. So there are many areas where we've invested too much political capital in terms of getting tighter global rules and restraining what each individual nation can do, and that's largely because we've had very powerful commercial, financial, business interests that are pushing for those, as in the areas of patents, intellectual property rights is a key example of that. And in other areas where we have not have similar mobilization because they're much more social, environmental, or the beneficiaries have not yet been able to organize, or the losers from more global rules would be wealthy corporations or wealthy individuals, as in the case of tax harmonization and tax fighting tax havens. So I think getting that balance right is what I was talking about.
Seeing as you're both experts on global inequality and globalization as a whole, what have been the effects of, or broadly, of the Washington Consensus on inequality? I mean, you talked about intellectual property. I imagine you're referencing the TRIPS agreement from the WTO in the 1990s. Could you provide some examples, perhaps, to our audience, of the Washington Consensus succeeding and examples of such policies failing? If we could start with Professor Milanovic.
You mean in terms of income inequality principally, or
income inequality, yeah, specifically?
It is actually very difficult. Of course, you have had a number of empirical and cross-country studies that, for example, looked at the effects of globalization on inequality, or different individual components of the Washington Consensus. I'm not sure really that I can remember something study that looked really at Washington Consensus as such, because obviously it has many different dimensions. But when it comes to individual countries, I don't think that there was ever in Washington Consensus or the application of policies, there was ever interest or concern precisely with the effects on income inequality. The Washington Consensus was driven, of course, by the concern about macro stability and to some extent about growth, which I think was, in that view of the world, would be basically derivative from the macro stability. If I continue along this line, then inequality would come next in some extent, of naturally, because of the assumption of trickle down, essentially. So I would see the movement to go logically from stability and these macroeconomic conditions being set in place, which in the view of the Washington Consensus would lead to growth, which in turn would lead to greater demand for, let's suppose, skilled or unskilled labor, and which would then sort of keep in check the increase of inequality. So there was no, I think, direct link between inequality and Washington Consensus. So I really, maybe I should think more about that, but I really cannot see the examples of the countries or periods where the application of the Washington Consensus has had sort of inequality reducing effects. I can see of the others. But if you take the examples of countries that we have sustainable, a relatively long run decline of inequality, mostly in Latin America, like Brazil, the reasons for that decline of inequality under Cardoso at first, and then Lula, and then Dilma, were really separate, I mean, different from the Washington Consensus. You know, it was an increase in the education level, increase in the funding of the public education, increase in the minimum wage, and of course, the increase in unconditional and conditional cash transfers. So, you know, I don't think that there was any sort of perceptible relationship between reduction of inequality and the Washington Consensus. But as I said, maybe I should think more. I cannot now offhand really think of the empirical cross-country work which actually identified specific features of the Washington Consensus and changes in inequality.
Mm-hmm. And so moving on now to the rise of China, which I mentioned earlier. So Professor Milanovic, once again, in your latest book, Capitalism Alone, you describe a sort of dialectic between the liberal meritocratic capitalism of the West and meritocratic, which you use in a very amoral term, and the political capitalism of China, and the possibility that the two centripetally tend towards a third system. Do you think that China's political capitalism will push it to favor a different kind of globalization, or is the US free trade model a policy that all strong economies tend to prefer once they're strong enough?
Well, I actually was somewhat, I mean, obviously the book has many other motivations, but when it comes to the sort of a relationship between liberal/meritocratic capitalism and political capitalism, it was also motivated by, I think, to some extent, reaction to what was then again in the 1990s view, somewhat simple-minded view, that you would actually have a convergence toward liberal capitalism throughout the world. We have seen that actually that did not happen. So the question is actually whether they would, you know, whether there would be continuation of the existence of different political arrangements, despite the fact that the economies are more or less organized the same. And that's of course why my argument is that China is a capitalist country. But on the political space, of course, it is organized differently, and it has implications for the economy, for the functioning of the economy as well. So one possibility is, of course, that actually they could converge, but they could converge to something which is different, either from political capitalism as such or liberal capitalism. And when I sort of discuss the elite formation and elite reproduction in the two systems, and inequalities of outcomes and inequalities in opportunities, one can actually entertain the idea, and I'm actually not saying that it would necessarily, that I believe it would necessarily happen, but one can entertain the idea that in both systems, you might end up with a unified politico-economic elite. In other words, to simplify things, in liberal capitalism like the United States, you would increasingly have the wealthy, the rich people, buying legislation and essentially influencing policymaking and creating sort of a combined economic and political elite. But the origin of their power would be really economic power. In the political system, political capitalism of China, and again, we see some indications of that there, you would have political power being essentially converted into economic power. So in both cases, you can actually, if you sort of extend your thinking a little bit further, you can see, well, we might end up with a sort of a unified elite, which is both political and economic elite. The origin of that elite may be different, but basically the outcome may be very similar. So this is a different type of convergence. As I said, I am not totally sold that it would necessarily happen, but I just see the forces in both systems which might lead both of them towards that outcome.
Okay. And then Professor Rodrik, is China doing anything different compared to what the US and Western European countries have been doing with international aid and development, in particular through the Belt and Road Initiative? Because we often hear about this in the Western media. It's quite a big topic, often presented in quite a threatening light. And so would you say that this is because the Western media is worried about this because it's just a non-power doing it, or is there something fundamentally different about China's approach to development?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think probably the first order answer to your question, I think, is that every major power pursues foreign economic policies that it perceives to be largely in its own interest. So no major power acts in a fully benign, disinterested, cosmopolitan manner. But the second order answer might be that there might be differences in the way that a nation relates to others that are an extensions of each nation's internal or domestic political economy. So the styles and therefore some of the implications of these network of relations might be very different. For example, let's go back to the world economic order that the United States largely created after the Second World War with a bit of help from the British and John Maynard Keynes, but it was largely the U.S. power and interest that were reflected in the creation of the IMF, the World Bank, and the trade order that collectively that we now know as the Bretton Woods. And it was very much clearly, it was in the interest of the United States, for example, to pursue a kind of a multilaterally open trade regime in order to be able to penetrate and disassemble the British system of trade preferences. And so for an economist, we say, the US was just pursuing free trade and multilateral free trade. But it wasn't really because the US really fundamentally believed in free trade and comparative advantage. It was a way of ensuring that the imperial trade preference system of the United States could be, of the UK, of Britain, could be essentially penetrated by the United States. Similarly, the regime of the monetary and financial regime that was set up to the chagrin of Keynes, of course, reflected a very sort of asymmetric outcome, which is that that all the burden of adjustment was going to be placed on debtor countries, but not on the creditor countries. And Keynes wanted a much more balanced system because he understood that countries like Britain would tend to be debtors in the post-war period, and therefore wanted to make sure that not all the burden of adjustment would fall on them. But the Americans prevailed, and essentially, there was no burden of adjustment placed on the creditor countries because the United States was expected to and was in fact a big creditor country. But so these are all the respects in which we see in this earlier area how a nation's own interests are reflected in the creation of the global economic or an economic order. It is also the case, however, and this is sort of my second order point, which is that some of the institutions, some of the legalism, some of the particular forms that these international economic arrangements took reflected an American sort of New Deal kind of administrative state type of arrangements. And so the United States, rather than doing everything on an ad hoc, bilateral kind of a way, set up rules, set up institutions, which in some cases it became subject to eventually in ways that it could not have anticipated before. And so you can say that some of the understanding of the U.S. system of rule of law, the U.S. administrative state, the U.S. New Deal understanding was reflected in the construction of these institutions, and that these provided broader benefits to the rest of the world, and sometimes rebounded against U.S. interests in ways that the U.S. could not have anticipated. Now, when we come to China, the first order point still stands that China is interested in setting up these network of relationships to ensure market access, to create markets for its surplus production of steel. So that a lot of the Belt and Road Initiative is just building stuff in other countries so it can export all its manufacturers and so forth. But beyond that, the second order point is that you don't have the creation of institutions that were in some sense universalistic and multilateral that we saw in the post-war period. We see much more ad hoc bilateral relations. And that, I think, is much more open to abuse. It's much more, but it's also, in a way, I would say, it's an extension of the internal political economy of China, that you don't have the same understanding of the rule of law. It operates in a very different manner. And I think, to some extent, I think it's, I would view that as slightly less benign set of relationships with other countries. And certainly with respect to, in a question like human rights, for example, I wouldn't argue that the United States pursued really policies in the rest of the world that were very careful with respect to human rights norms. But there is a domestic pressure for that the U.S. is restrained at what it can do in other countries, is restrained, and that China is not in quite the same way. So I think there are some second order differences, but not necessarily first order differences.
Okay. And so, yep, so if you wanted to react to that.
Can I say a few things? Maybe you were going to ask me the question, but just in case that you don't, I would preempt you. I would like to say a few things about the question on China and the role of China, especially in Africa. I think it seems to me that I'm more, how should I say, optimistic, or more of the opinion that China would exert well, it's not necessarily benign, but a positive effect there. Let me explain there. I think I have 3 points there. The first one, I believe that actually many of the international institutions like the World Bank have gone too far in sort of non-tangible type of investments, which have to do with governance, with civil rights organizations, NGOs, and all that. And on many of them, I'm actually quite skeptical. I think that, for example, many NGOs get basically kidnapped, taken over by small constituencies within the countries that present themselves as being sort of the voice of the, of the country, but they are not necessarily so. In any case, I think that what China is contributing is the return to what I believe is preferable, which means really a brick and mortar type of investments, which characterize, of course, international organizations like the World Bank much earlier in the 60s and the 50s and so on. So I think this is first the welcome change, which of course I think would improve infrastructure in Africa. And we know that infrastructure improvement in China was one of the very important concomitant sort of factors which led to Chinese growth. Secondly, and there is an indirect effect, Africa is of course extremely important in terms of global inequality or generally like globalization, whether it would finally start catching up and converging to rich countries' incomes or not. That Africa, the fact that China has been so much involved or attracted to Africa has increased the geopolitical importance of Africa in the eyes of Western countries. So indirectly, I think they have started actually now worrying and paying attention to Africa much more than before, simply because of geopolitical competition with China. The third point, which actually Dani alluded to, and this is, I think, interesting point, is that China does not have any experience of international organization building. And when it's not surprising, if, for example, read a very nice book by Mark Mazover, Governing the World, you see that basically all international organizations have been really created by Western powers from basically after Napoleonic Wars, from the postal stamp union, postal union, to all the way to the Bretton Woods institutions and World Trade Organization. I mean, somewhat jokingly, but I think truly, the only other power that created the global institution was the Soviet Union with the Comintern. And basically, you don't have other institutions that are not created essentially by a handful of Western countries. So China is really entering there in a totally uncharted water. And as Dani said, it would probably project, and we see that, its own internal sort of structure on this global institution building. But I still believe it is, of course, it would be very difficult for China to do that, but I think it's still useful that China is trying to do it, in some sense replicating or trying to replicate what the US did after the World War II. So in that sense also, I believe that China's influence is on balance positive because of an attempt to create something which would sort of represent an alternative to what exists now.
Yeah, and the fact that it presents perhaps a different model or a different solution might offer a solution to the sort of dogmatism that arose with the Washington Consensus. So now we're nearing the end now. So I was thinking we could maybe engage in a bit of a speculation over the effects of the COVID-19 crisis, although the data isn't clear yet. So Professor Rodrik, you said in a recent article that much of the growth in the developing world outside of East Asia was based on demand-side factors, public investment and natural resource booms in particular, that were unsustainable. Export-oriented industrialization, the most reliable vehicle for long-term development, appears to have run its course. And so with this new economic depression, do you think that these trends have been accelerated, entirely replaced, or will they persist? How are poor countries going to develop in the future?
I think the pandemic simply reinforces trends that were already taking place. So when I said that growth in the developing world was largely demand-driven and unsustainable, I was referring really to the experience of the last 2 decades or so. And the puzzle for the last 2 decades is that there has been a significant amount of growth, particularly in some of the lowest income countries in the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, even just before the crisis, Cote d'Ivoire, they were really growing very, very rapidly. And just superficially, one might have thought that this was the next East Asia, that these were the countries that were, because they were essentially growing at East Asian rates. But when one looks closely, it was clear there was a very different type of growth. By the way, that's also true of India, which is a huge, important country because it has so many poor people there. But neither in India nor in any of the African cases I've mentioned was growth really based on real structural change, real structural transformation, industrialization, the usual historically sort of sort of robust and sustained sort of drivers of economic growth. The story, the story behind growth, differs from country to country, but it was, when you look closely, a lot of it is just basically demand driven, either from foreign aid or foreign transfers or from ramping up public investment. Interestingly, in India, it's actually a lot of it is the private investment, sort of the animal spirits of the private sector after the 1980s really really take a turn in a very optimistic direction, and you have kind of a bootstrapping kind of a growth, and that there's a big ramp up in private investment that pulls some resources into more productive services. This shows up as an increase in overall productivity in the economy. So the initial optimism is validated by the subsequent productivity growth. But unlike export-oriented industrialization, this is not a dynamic that can be sustained. And in fact, in India and in other countries, you were seeing just before the pandemic that growth was coming down. I think, unfortunately, the pandemic just hits these countries with a huge sort of body blow, and all these countries are taking a very big hit. And I don't think they will be going back to the kinds of growth that they had before, and we'll need to really rethink our growth strategy, because that industrialization has really run out of fuel for a bunch of reasons, that it's not absorbing resources anymore. And of course, the kind of increased protectionism and the crisis in the advanced countries isn't helping much either. So we will need to, I think, rethink afresh.
Professor Milanovic, did you want to react to that?
Well, maybe to your question about the effects of the pandemic, I agree with Dani, and I saw that he wrote about that the crisis is really the accelerant for many of the sort of forces that were already present there. I think it's not something very original, but we're really dealing in this case with an unprecedented event to a large extent. I'm actually very pessimistic about the, how should I say, post-crisis world, in the sense that I don't believe that we will have what is called the V recovery, in the sense that actually the changes that would be brought by the pandemic, politically and socially, during the time that it lasts, would be such that actually they would influence economic growth in the future. So in other words, to make an example very clear, actually, I don't think that we can consider the effects of the pandemic as when you turn on and off the lights. So we had lights, then of course we turned it, the pandemic turned it off, and then basically we go back, we turn the switch on, and we are back to where we were before. As I wrote recently, I said, even if it were miraculously to end in December 2020, it would not be like December 2019, lagged by 12 months. It would be something totally different. Which we see politically as we speak. There will be such significant changes in quite a lot of countries, politically, socially, people who have lost jobs, companies that have been closed, and so on, that would actually really have a longer term impact on many of them. And it would have the impact of what happens to global inequality, what happens to the convergence, despite the fact, of course, that China seems now to have actually been affected in terms of growth rate less than the West. Again, this is something that we don't know how it would play out in the years to come. We don't know whether India would actually have, currently I've seen -5%, but -5% in 1 year, would it be next year 0? Would it be again -3, or would it be +3? We don't know. So we are really in a very sort of very unique juncture in terms of the economic growth and thereby also global inequality. So I think there is actually the forecasts of what will happen are fraught with an incredible amount of uncertainty.
Yeah, of course. So last question, Professor Milanovic, in an article you wrote for Foreign Affairs in March, you talked about the effects of this lockdown, and you mentioned a possibility that states return to self-sufficiency, away from globalization and back to a natural economy. You mentioned this possible horizon of 6 months of lockdown. It was, probably an approximation, or after which firms will start to redesign supply chains. How would such a natural economy look like, and would this be beneficial, especially in the light of the need to reduce global carbon emissions and to relaunch growth?
No, let me just make clear, I didn't mean that actually we would go to really self-sufficient economy. What I meant is that actually, I put a self-sufficient economy as a sort of an end point, just to indicate, as Dani was saying before about globalization, just to indicate the other polar case. From ultra globalization, the other sort of polar case at the other end of the spectrum is really natural economy. So I do believe that the pandemic is really representing a setback for globalization. And I think that actually, because of political uncertainties, because of greater difficulties of moving factors of production, including individuals, people, we cannot now travel easily between the countries, and that could of course improve, but it would improve with stop and go type of policies. We may be able to travel a little bit more, and then a little bit less, and then a little bit more again. Likewise for the movement of capital. So what I meant is actually it would represent a shock to global value chains, to investments, like long distance investment, if you will, if you want to call it like that. And in that sense, it would be a setback to globalization. But obviously, we are not going to go all the way back to the self-sufficient economies. That's not, I think, in the cards. But whether it would actually sort of deglobalize us a little bit, I think it will.
And Professor Rodrik, would you think similarly returning to maybe regional economies or that sort of thing be more beneficial?
You know, as I said, there are some aspects where I think, as you know, stepping back from hyperglobalization may be desirable. I would put some restraints on financial globalization. I think sort of getting away from existing models of trade agreements that restrict regulatory space within countries. I think that would be desirable. But there are, a lot of areas where we need more global public goods. I think, public health and climate change are two big areas where I think the more global cooperation we have, and these problems have to be addressed at a global level, I think the better off we're going to be.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us today. That's it for for the event, and make sure to listen to our podcasts online. We'll be uploading one next week about careers at the Institute for Fiscal Analysis, and great, thank you very much.